Hello everybody, welcome along to this video. I'm going to talk quickly in this introduction because this is revising the 15 power and conflict poems. As there's been 15, I'm going to try and do it in very much less than 15 minutes. So be ready to pause, be ready just to really take on board the main ideas of these poems. I'll be exploring particularly how they link to power, how they link to conflict, and mainly some of the key ideas that you need to remember. So without further ado then, here we go. They're in order that they appear in the anthology. And first up we have got Ozymandias. So as it says on the left, the remains of a statue found in the desert. It's almost like this story is being told, and we hear about this cruel dictator who had this like sneering face of cold command. It's described about as well, how it stands there, the boundless and bare in the desert, the lone and level sand stretched far away, almost as if the desert is taking back over. So yes, he was powerful, but as it says in the bottom right, the power of time, the power of nature seems to be explored in this poem, and also how power doesn't last forever. And we're also looking really at the conflict between humans, but also the conflict between nature and time being key ones there. Moving on, we've got London, a poem about the corruption of a city. It really is also about how that corruption affects the poorest in there as well. We talk about like harlots on the street, which are prostitutes, and like the cries of these people. You've got like how their lives are being controlled, but also it hints about this idea of revolution as well, almost with the blood running down the palace walls as well, the hapless soldiers sigh. And really this one's about the power of a place, certainly, but also maybe the power of our minds. It talks about the mind-forged manacles at one point as well, maybe the power of leaders and their influence over a city which has been corrupted because of them, and also the conflict between classes. It really does feel like there's a division between rich and poor inside of this poem, which is very much a poem about place. Then we come on to extract from the Prelude, another one which could be very much linked to place as well. So this is the poet revisiting the time that he stole a rowing boat way back when he was a child, and as he's rowing out across the lake he feels the guilt. It almost feels like nature is watching over him is how he goes about it, and therefore he returns and he puts the boat back, but for days afterwards he can't get rid of this feeling. And really we've got like the idea of power of nature in this one as well, because he's just out there rowing and suddenly it talks about these huge peaks, black and huge, towering up and almost rising up between him and the stars. Then he also talks later on about o'er my thoughts there hung a darkness, is what he said, just showing like the impact that it's had on his brain, because he doesn't see these green fields he talks about anymore. Instead it's been replaced by these black images, all these dark images. And we also could see this as like the conflict between humans and nature as well. Moving on then to My Last Duchess. So this is almost like a monologue really, this one. A duke is showing off a painting of his last duchess, as he says, so his former wife. He didn't like the fact that she didn't really show him the proper gratitude that he wanted, because she's actually looking and sort of kind towards others and smiling, and he implies throughout the poem that somehow she's been removed and no longer there. So he never explicitly talks about her murder, but it does feel like that's something that's happened. And really what we see in this poem is the power of jealousy, but also this like the power of control of one person over another, and even like the power of class, how he almost has this rank and title that he seems to give him this confidence. And then we got the conflict, like the conflict between humans, but also between like reason and jealousy. He's upset that she ranks his title of 700 years old, or however many hundred years it is, against anyone else's gifts. And he calls it like a gift as well that he's given her. He talks about like references to her throat at one point as well. Then we move on to Charge of the Light Brigade, very much a narrative poem which tells you the story, and it's the account of bad orders that led to the slaughter of soldiers in the Battle of Balaclava, which you see pictured in the screen there. The soldiers are presented heroically, but they've got to follow the orders of those in command, even though they will lead ultimately to their deaths. And then really it talks about onwards, rode the 600, boldly they rode and well. But then it returns later into the cannons, like cannons to the left, cannons to the right, cannons to the front. But then they ride back and not the 600, and they're presented as heroically throughout. The power here, maybe, the power of discipline, the power of having to follow orders, because it says there's not a reason why, there's to do and die. And then we get conflict between the soldiers and the commanders maybe, and obviously there's a literal conflict here of war. We move on to Exposure, another poem set in war, but this time set in the trenches of the First World War, so somewhere between 1914 and 1918. And really it's a poem about soldiers waiting in the trenches, waiting for their orders, waiting for something to happen to them, but rather than the other soldiers from the other side being the enemy, it's the weather that's presented as an enemy to them, and it's personified, because throughout the poem we have but nothing happens, but it talks about the merciless iced east winds that knife us, It talks about the flowing flakes that come feeling for our faces, and there's lots of this sort of very much imagery to do with nature being against them. Therefore, a poem about the power of nature, the power of the weather specifically as well, maybe the power of the mind, but certainly conflict between humans and conflict between humans and nature. Then we move on to Storm on the Island, another poem about conflict, but again, another poem about weather, so it actually compares really well with Exposure. Quite literally a description of a storm hitting an island, which sounds very exposed. Also sounds like it's used to it as well, and the people are used to it. Really, it's a metaphor, this poem, for the troubles which took place in Northern Ireland during the whole of the 1900s, pretty much, really. We have the power of nature in this poem. It talks about the waves exploding comfortably down on the cliffs. We also hear how the sea is turned like a tame cat turned savage, and how it spits at them. We've also got this conflict between humans and nature and the weather as well. Then you get bayonet charge. It's almost like a pause in a moment. You've got this soldier charging forward in battle, moving towards a hedge that is sort of dazzled with rifle fire, it says. And it's like this moment in time because it pauses and just reflects on how the soldier seems very, very small against everything that's going on, and it almost seems quite insignificant. You've got like the power of nature. It sounds like the effects on nature because you've got this hedge that dazzled with rifle fire. It talks about the cold clockwork, like this metaphor of time, and how he seems like a very small cog in like the clockwork of time. And also really the conflict between humans and nature. It is very much a poem set in war, so that sort of conflict. Then we move on to Remains, often a very popular choice for people. What you hear is a soldier's account about the time they shot some bank looters in some foreign country. We don't know when exactly. But ultimately it flashes back. He cannot remove these images from his mind of this person being shot, and the after effects of that, and the blood shadow that he sees on the streets. Talks about the bullets that almost rip right through him. And then he goes on to talk about he's here still, dug into my brain, or dug into my mind, I think are the words he used, and he sort of sounds upset and angry but can't get rid of it, possibly armed, probably not. So definitely got the power of the mind here, the power of memory, the power of war as well, and definitely conflict. There's quite literally a conflict there, but actually more deeply you've got the internal conflict that goes on within yourself about your own guilt and your own decisions, and it haunts him. Then we move on to Poppies. So this time we've got a mother's perspective, and this is her son going off to war and she's left behind. We don't know if this is a flashback. We don't know whether the son is dead or not. It's very ambiguous about that, but she's reminded of him and certainly his childhood as she moves through the house. Releases a songbird from its cage at one point is what she says, whether that's her letting the memory go of him. She's there at the beginning, sort of sellotape bandaged around her hand, and she's rounding up cat hairs off his suit, so really mothering him. And by the end of the poem it talks about she still hears his playground voice catching on the wind, a memory, so maybe hinting that really he has gone. But here we get the power of war, because it's almost like he's intoxicated, she says, as the world overflows like a treasure chest. There's also the power of love and memory as well, these powerful memories, maybe the power of loss and the impact it's had on her, if he is indeed dead. And then we've got conflict between the freedom and control. She wants to give her son freedom and let him go, but also doesn't want to lose him and almost wants to control his decision making maybe, and therefore the conflict that is war as well here, because we are talking about a soldier. War photographer, Carol Ann Duffy, a photographer again reliving memories. You might see a pattern of memories coming through here, of conflicts as he's developing the photographs, the negatives that you see in front of you there, and those photos slowly come through and develop on the paper. He talks about half-formed ghosts in fact appearing, and it reminds him of this time of this woman, and he asks her for permission to photograph a husband who seems to be dying in this conflict zone as well. But ultimately he's very upset, this photographer, because he's doing all this work and seeing all these horrible images, and which are repeating in his mind as he develops the photos, and yet only 5 or 6 will be chosen for the Sunday supplements, which are the newspapers, and somebody might look at those with wipe away the tears while they're having their bath and pre-lunch beers, and off he flies again, and he just seems like almost like they don't care. So with the power of memory once again, as he's developing these photos, they're triggering memories, but also the power of conflict on people, similar to Remains in some senses, reliving those things, and the lack of power as well over, you've got a lack of control of making people feel something. And then you've got this conflict between emotions, but also attention, how we aren't paying enough attention maybe to what's going on, or we pay very brief attention and then it's gone. Quite literally set against a conflict as well. It mentions places like Beirut and Phnom Penh. Then we move on to tissue, a very, very metaphorical response I put there to life being fragile, and that's represented by lots of different examples of types of paper that flies our life, like paper kites she talks about in the poem, and talking about like receipts, which and weighing up things and so forth, and grocery slips. But ultimately she talks as well about building structures, living structures not meant to last. Again, almost like we create things, but actually, ultimately, life is more powerful and nobody lasts forever. It's a very deep poem, this one. The power of time comes up here as well, and maybe the power of life and the world controlling us, and are we too controlled by the world? And then there's a conflict between our lives and maybe what really matters in our lives, sort of contrast lots of things about control and how paper maybe controls our lives because of what's written on that paper. We move on to the Emigree, another one which is about memory. In this case, it's the memory of a place, of what a place was like in this speaker's memory, and then we sort of get hints that this place maybe has changed ever since then. However, she can't stop feeling these positive feelings, even though she has this feeling that it's changed since. Like she talks about the tanks in her mind rolling down, and yet she describes this place that tastes of sunlight still. You've got the power of memory once again here, and yet again also the conflict between our mind and also the reality of something, the picture in our heads versus the reality of what something might be now. Checking out my history, a much more light-hearted tone to this one, about a speaker discovering their history and contrasting what they were taught in school, references to Dick Whittington and Robin Hood and Hey Diddle Diddle the Cat and the Fiddle, but didn't learn about things like Nanny Maroon. Toussaint de Louverture is another one as well. Lots of black icons through history who achieved great things, and yet they were left off the curriculum because of the white-centered education. So what you're looking at here then is the power of knowledge, maybe the power of history as well, which helps form your identity, which could again be the power of your identity, and the conflict between the ruling class and the people in charge making decisions and the minorities and what they're allowed to discover and what they're taught about themselves. So again, conflict between identities, you could also argue there as well. And then finally we move on to Kamikaze. So this is the one about the Japanese pilot. He was returned from a suicide mission. He was meant to fly his plane into something, taking his own life and the life of others, but after seeing the beauty, particularly of the seas beneath him, with the boats strung out like bunting it talks about in the green-blue translucent sea, nature's beauty almost causes him to turn back, but then ultimately his family disowns him because he brings shame on them by not completing his mission, which was meant to be his destiny. So here you've got the power of nature, society's expectations, because though he came home, we never spoke again in his presence. And then it also talks about the line which he had wondered which was the better way to die, whether he had actually killed himself in that plane or coming back and being an outcast and therefore is almost dead in some ways to them. So there's this conflict between life and death, maybe the conflict between humans and nature as well, and what it causes, the conflict within his mind, you could argue as well. Regardless, that does take us to the end of a very, very quick recap. Hopefully you've used it just as a quick recap to remind you. There are all of these poems explored in much more depth in my other videos on the channel, so if you have a poem which is a weakness for you, stop, go back, watch one of those videos, make some notes and turn it into your strength. Try and feel confidence with these poems. The other point I'd make at this moment as well is that although you do need to have a knowledge of all of these poems to some extent, there are some poems which you could really focus your attention on much more. I like to call them the big six, if I can remember all six off the top of my head. Kamikaze is one, absolutely. Exposure is definitely another, as is Remains, as is Poppies, as is Storm on the Island, and Exposure. For me, having a knowledge of those means that you've definitely got a broad range of poems that you can compare very well to whatever might come up in the exam when they name the poem, and then it's up to you to choose the poem to compare it with. Nevertheless, I'm going to end it here. I've managed to get through 15 poems in way under 15 minutes. Hopefully you found it useful. As said, check out my other videos, including a video where I talk you through how to actually write comparisons of poems with a really good strategy that you can use to help you get marks. Thanks for watching all the way to the end, everybody. Goodbye.